Recording now.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to SIG Auth, February 21st, 2018. Let's start off with announcements. Same as last 2 weeks ago, Code Freeze is coming up on the 26th, which is, what is that, Monday? Any feature level changes need to be in by then. Bug fixes will continue past that, I think. We'll start focusing on stabilizing end-to-end tests. Any other announcements before we move on?
I actually have one, which is that Tim Allclair's the nomination to make Tim Allclair a SIG lead did go through. We at least merged that change. So welcome, Tim, and thanks for leading your first SIG Auth.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
Happy to be here. Moving on, the token request authenticator needs review. Mike, are you on the call? Would you like
to? So this is the latest in my series that changes I want to get into 110. So far, it has not been reviewed. This is the authenticator bit, so I have a registry bit that seems like it's about to be wrapped up, poke Jordan, but this part hasn't been reviewed yet, so would love to get some eyes on it if anybody is interested.
Great, thanks. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Just to clarify, that's a refactor of the existing service account authenticator to allow for reuse of some of its core bits for the new service accounts?
No, that is actually complete and merged. So the actual authenticator and package service account is generic enough to support both new and old service account token types. So this just adds a validation logic for the new type of service account, and it will append another bearer token authenticator that will be separate from the current service account token authenticator to the token authenticator chain. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, awesome, thanks.
Right, moving on. Our designs are sort of our discussion for this week, so we'll punt on those. Krishna Suriramad, I'm sorry, added the documenting KMS encryption provider.
Tim, just call me KK. That's what I'm doing.
Sorry. Yeah, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, it's just rounding out the documentation for the KMS provider PR that we committed. So if anyone has any comments on what the doc needs to change, how it needs to change, where it needs to live, take a look at the PR and the associated issue. Post your comments there. We'll try and get it in 1.10.
The PR is against the Oracle fork of the Kubernetes website.
Yeah, we'll upstream it later today.
Okay. Why not just submit it against the Kubernetes website repo?
Oracle processes. Thanks.
Okay, so
I'm done, Tim. We can move on to the next time.
Yeah, thank you. So moving on to the next item, we have 10 open PRs in the 110 milestone. So these should all be moved, or sorry, merged by the 26th, or punted to 111. So these are the open issues here. We talked about the token authenticator. There's a couple audit PRs open. Actually, I did want to call out that one of the open issues is to move advanced auditing to GA in 110. I don't know if Mick or Stefan are on the call, but I do think we should consider punting GA on audit out a release, since it seems like there's still some API level concerns with auditing. Are there any thoughts on that? Okay. Any comments on the other open PRs or issues?
I think Greg was trying to say something, but he's trying to figure out his mic.
Oh.
Okay, never mind. If he figures it out, he'll get back later.
All right, so I think we can move on to our discussions for the week. So I shared out a document last week on container isolation, and this is a space that I've been thinking a lot about, and tried to capture all of my thoughts in this document. I would like to put out a design proposal in the next month, and I'm hoping that this is something that we can get to alpha in the 111 release. Now, I think a lot of this is more on the SIG node side, but since this is an important piece for multi-tenancy and kind of protecting resources at the container layer, I did want to call it out in SIG Auth. And in particular, some of the crossover with pod identity. And if we ever decide to do container identity or per pod identity, then there's some important crossover between being able to sandbox those identities. And another piece is network policy, whether that gets integrated in here. In general, I'm considering kind of the cluster level isolation that is typically owned by SIG Auth to be out of scope for this, but there is definitely some crossover in the network and identity pieces. And then also pod policy of, if we want to require a cluster with sandboxes, I think that's also out of scope and should continue to be owned by something like the pod security policy. Are there any questions on this document or this topic that people would like to go into here?
I think it was a pretty good document. I did appreciate how you guys kept from being too opinionated about implementations. I think that was it makes the doc read a lot more, it really clarifies the problem space pretty well. So I think that was well done.
Thanks.
I had some questions just about sort of, I know this came up in SIG-Node because I was there, but talking about sort of the goals of the proposal, it seems to me, and if I'm too far off, then please let me know, but it seems to me that the goal is to sort of define some sort of API that looks kind of like a pod, but is more for very isolated workloads that we're basically describing as a sandbox, that it'd be some sort of isolated version of a pod where all the security defaults are set up in such a way that they're extremely restrictive rather than being sort of open by default and restricting them later. Is that a fair sort of?
Let me clarify a few things on that. First of all, this isn't really a proposal at this point. It's more like these are all the problems that we want to solve, and these are all the considerations that the solution needs to kind of take into account. So I'm not actually proposing any changes at this point. Now, in terms of kind of like what the direction that we're going, like what I would like to see the proposal and the solution become is sort of a general purpose sandboxing mechanism that offers a stronger degree of isolation than we currently have with Linux containers. And I think one of the key differences I see with Linux container isolation and the sandbox is, in general, the way to further isolate Linux containers is by kind of scoping down the capabilities. And this is something that requires a certain amount of expertise in Linux technologies, and also is very workload specific and not portable between different workloads. And so that the investment that you have to put into kind of hardening those containers doesn't scale to all of your workloads. So the idea is to take a technology like Kata containers, and we want to make it pluggable so that there's lots of different options. But to take something like Kata containers where you put the whole container in a VM and your workload can have full access to syscalls and capabilities within that VM, or you can scope it down for some kind of application level hardening, but you're still contained within that VM isolation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks.
I did want to call out that I think that one of the biggest open questions is that of the sandbox layer. If you were in SIG Node yesterday, there was a bunch of discussion around this. I got some really good suggestions for how to move forward with this decision. But this is the question of whether containers within a pod need the same level of isolation from each other. If we implement sandboxes at the pod layer, so kind of just add a sandbox bit on the pod spec, for example, then that's much more consistent with the current Kubernetes resource sharing and pod models, and would be much simpler to implement. But if we do decide that we need that container level isolation, then we need to explore some new options. And so actually that gets to the other piece of your question, which was whether it's introducing a new concept. If we implement sandboxes at the pod layer, I don't think we need to introduce a kind of a new abstraction. I think it's just a setting on a pod, basically. Whereas if we want that sub-pod isolation, then we might introduce a new sandbox layer between the pod and the container or something like that. Any other questions about container isolation, or questions or concerns or thoughts?
So I had a question. So firstly, hi. I generally lurk in other places than being on the SIG Auth call. What would I guess I don't understand what the really compelling reason to look at either subpod or containers would be versus the sandboxing for the pod. And I say that from a position of trying to help my current developers make good choices around Kube. Like another layer of abstraction or another kind of little security box I have to go and draw on diagrams for people is probably going to lead to less secure usages rather than more. So I don't understand the motivations there.
Yeah, so again, that's kind of getting at why we really strongly would prefer to keep it at the pod layer instead of introducing this new kind of abstraction, new complexity, and whatnot. But the reason we're even talking about this, I think there are kind of two big use cases, or like buckets that a lot of the use cases fall into. One is where you want to run a sidecar that has higher privileges or trust or a different identity from other containers in the pod. So one example might be you're running a web server, and then you have a sidecar that, let's say, pushes metrics from the server to your internal monitoring infrastructure, and that needs authorization to talk to that monitoring infrastructure, but you don't want a vulnerability in the web server to expose that. And so there you might want to isolate that sidecar from the web server, or any kind of like situation where the sidecar needs privileged host access for a proxy or something like that. Device management is another example.
I would say it could go the other way too, where you maybe have a sidecar written by a third party that you don't want to have the same access as your main workload.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to include that use case. It's definitely something that we've talked a lot about. My concern is that every example of that I've seen, that third-party sidecar still needs to be able to access the main workload. So an example might be you have a monitoring solution that's deployed as a sidecar. That monitoring container is going to need fairly high level of visibility into your main container, and it's going to be hard to sandbox that. Another example is the Istio proxy, where it's a little easier to sandbox, but you're terminating your TLS in the Istio proxy, which means it has access to all of the web traffic going into that supported container. And I kind of question how much security you're really getting by sandboxing that.
So are you saying you're assuming that the sidecar always has higher privileges in a sense than the main container?
No, that's definitely not an assumption. But I think for most of the for the most compelling use cases I've seen for the kind of isolating sidecars, that's the main one. Another example of this is like a software as a service SaaS provider, where you're running some kind of untrusted user code in one container, and you have your sort of like trusted first-party sidecars that either manage that user container or potentially expose some services to it within the same network namespace. But the suggestion I got for how to make this decision and how to move forward on this is to enumerate all of the really specific examples that we can come up with for needing this, and then to examine what the alternative solutions are. So basically, if we move forward with pod level isolation, what does that mean for these use cases? Are there alternative solutions? And so I will be sharing out that document soon. And if anyone has other examples of use cases, I'd really appreciate input there.
Does it actually make sense to say that, like, a sidecar is just kind of something we name it? If we name the sidecar the more privileged container, I think it's actually the same use case or the same thing, right? Or am I missing?
Yeah. I'm kind of using sidecar loosely as just other containers in the pod. But I think it is important to note that this isolation is directional. And so unless you're talking about putting each one in a separate sandbox, if you're kind of privileged containers, if you want to isolate the other containers from, isolate the privileged containers from the other containers, then the sandbox needs to be around the other ones. And actually, that's kind of a good meta point to emphasize, is that the problem of sandboxing is specifically keeping things in the sandbox from accessing things outside of the sandbox, and not the other way around, which is a much a harder and very different problem. Are there any other comments on this topic, or should we move on to the bug bounty? All right. Maya, would you like to present your bug bounty proposal?
Sure. So we've had some discussions at some of the past SIG Auth meetings about potentially doing a Kubernetes bug bounty program. The idea would be to have a bug bounty for core with some additional suggested security best practices, like if you implemented pod security policy properly and all those kinds of things. The idea is really to attract additional security researchers and kind of get people excited about the security of Kubernetes. So I think I sent this out yesterday. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, if it makes sense to go through some details. Otherwise, there's some discussion questions at the end that I particularly wanted to touch on today. Great, yeah, thanks. So, in general, is this something that we'd like to pursue, and what kinds of concerns do we have? One thing in particular that to keep in mind is that we're definitely going to see an uptick in the reports of vulnerabilities to the team, and is that something that we're willing to address in the next couple of months?
So I had a couple of very quick thoughts on that. So most of you guys probably don't know me. I helped set up the vulnerability management teams for OpenStack and Cloud Foundry. And one of the things you'll find is that, when you bring in a bug bounty program, depending on what your ingestion process is, or you end up with a very significant amount of noise coming in. I'm not involved in any way with the vulnerability management stuff in Kubernetes today, but I'm sure it's already getting inundated with lots of people that are just running scans and submitting output from various tools. And that's only going to get significantly worse than the initial ramp up. It's probably obvious to everybody on this call, but I just wanted to make sure that people really understood what they were signing up for if they went down this road, which I think is the right road to go down, and potentially even one I might be able to help with. But yeah, I thought that was important to mention.
Yeah, I mean, to take a step back, because I didn't give any overview. The idea would be to have the proposal here is to have a third-party platform do the initial triage. It would be on an open, independent platform that the current product security team would have access to. Same triage process in the sense that somebody would send an email to Kubernetes, et cetera, but it would get triaged by this third party. And then once all that happened, it would go to the product security team. Product security team would fix and respond as they do today, and payment would be given out from some pool of money held by this third party. I'm still trying to figure out if Google is willing to fund it fully. That's unclear at this point in time. Some of the main concerns are, do we think that the triage is going to be sufficient given by this third party? Do we think that the scope is going to be well enough defined and that the bugs are going to be reproducible across different platforms and different builds? And then to what I think Robert was just saying, like, do we know that we can actually handle the bugs that come in that are legitimate? Like, are we willing to actually jump on these, presumably an influx of P0s and P1s coming in?
I don't think there's a problem with the actual fixing of the bugs that we find. I think that the hardest part will be defining the scope and then defining the rules that a cluster needs to abide by, and the fact that the bugs will be valid. Because today, if someone's going to report something, it's going to be most likely anything that's a configuration problem where they just configured their cluster wrong. So we would need like a set of scripts or tools for defining that your cluster was actually valid and not set up poorly. And then from there, if the bugs are actually able to follow through on those, then we should actually fix those problems and quickly. And I think that we would be fine with that.
I think that makes sense. I think there's a lot of tooling opportunities and things to help address some of that, like having fairly standard architectures deployed, or leveraging things like GKE to just say, okay, if that actually works over here, then that makes sense. One of the issues that I think you may run into is that second stage validation. Last time I looked, there were only a handful of people doing vulnerability management for Kube, which is fine and in many ways good. But you run into problems of running around then chasing development leads and people in the various SIGs and other areas to actually come and have a look at these bugs. So it's wider than just the immediate security community. I mean, you mentioned money and things. It's not, IBM has many issues, of which bug bounties are just one challenge. But it's certainly something we could help with in terms of headcount for helping to do some validation and things, and help on the security front end. But the point I'm meandering towards is that this needs to be a wider conversation with the various tech leads and things, because a lot of stuff is going to land on their desk, which it happens infrequently, but will probably ramp up and will include things that the security team thought was a problem, but turned out to not be. And, that raises frustration, which increases the degree of friction that you have between the security team and normal developers and all that fun stuff. It quickly becomes a difficult thing to manage if you don't have the right processes in place to do with the validation.
I think the difference though is that our security team is people who contribute to Kubernetes. So a lot of the times we actually know if it's a real bug or not. I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of context into what is happening. But yes, we do have to find the teams that can go then say fix the bug specifically if it's not something that we necessarily have expertise in. But I feel like it's more a community effort than we're throwing something over a wall.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I've never worked on a VMT that wasn't comprised of people that were contributors first. Just with any large complex system, you can't expect that small handful of people to understand everything well enough to know whether or not it's a genuine problem in all circumstances. And when you take that same group of people with that same expectation and then reasonably quadruple the amount of reports that land on their desk, then they are necessarily going to have to hand more stuff off to the developers than they would do on a day-to-day basis. And it's, I think everything in here makes sense. It's just the wider conversation needs to be had, that's all.
To clarify what you're asking, Robert, are you suggesting that the second level triage that's currently done by the product security team either be expanded to include other individuals or an expanded product security team? And or are you just kind of saying, hey, we need to give all the other SIGs heads up? I definitely agree on the second one. I don't personally have an opinion on the first one.
No, I'm very much focused on that second point, really, which is that they need to be bought into this. And, not everybody recognizes that having a whole bunch of security bugs land in their queue is a good thing. So maybe that needs to be finessed a little bit as well.
Fair.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a question of coordinating this spike. I don't know, somewhere between perhaps Robert's pessimism and Jess's optimism. But yeah, I think I agree on kind of giving the other SIGs a heads up, and also we need to be careful about not putting a big announcement about this right before code freeze or in another super crunch time for Kubernetes developers right before KubeCon or something like that too. I think we need to be careful about where we put this spike and how we line up the resources to handle that spike, given that the resources all work in different companies.
Yeah, two comments on that. One, I think our current kind of triage process is we've got this product security team, and it's a little bit of whoever responds first or jumps on the issue first or sees the issue first. becomes the owner. And I think it would be worth setting up an explicit kind of rotation or division of labor there. It's maybe more of a discussion to have with the product security team, but just kind of something that would help to deal with that spike. And then the other piece is, I think our security fix and release process is getting better, but still is not nearly as streamlined as it could be. And we may want to invest some resources in making that process a little smoother before we unleash the flood.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would have to adjust our processes to be able to handle it, but I don't think it's nearly impossible. It's just like, well, we're gonna have to work out those kinks.
Yeah, agreed.
I just had a question for the people on the current triage team about scope and how we define that today. A lot of the sort of most egregious kind of vulnerabilities or sort of things that we worry about often come from like lack of configuration or setting it up wrong, or people enabling certain add-ons. And I was wondering, how do we handle those type of reports today versus actual bugs in, say, the TLS handling in the API server?
So sorry. Oh, I was gonna say, we don't get many of those like to the actual email address, but I see blog posts on the internet obviously all the time where people configured it wrong. And there was one time like right now. But I think that a lot of like the conformance tests that we have as our goals for multi-tenancy can come into play here, in that like if you run your conformance tests on this cluster and it's passing the multi-tenancy ones, then you should be in a good spot for like having some sort of confidence in your cluster to be good. And I'm hoping that that will like solve that problem.
I think there's still some questions around like plugins. Like even if you're running a compliant cluster, if you're running a third-party controller that has root access to the cluster, then obviously you're going to run into some problems there.
Who owns the plugins that you're talking about, Tim?
Yeah, so obviously plugins that are outside of the Kubernetes org should be out of scope. But what about all of the different projects that are in Kubernetes Incubator, which is,
That's
maybe
a little
200?
sketchy. Yeah, so at Shopify, we run a number of successful bug bounty programs, and what we've determined through our ecosystem is that anything third party is definitely out of scope. Anything that's like alphas is out of scope, but we would report it to whomever those developers were. We've had pretty great success with that, and we're going to be definitely leveraging this reporting of vulnerabilities to the Kubernetes platform, because we're anticipating to open up something very similar to a bug bounty program for runtime container security. More to follow on that. I don't want to announce anything yet, but I'm really curious on this.
I think to jump a bit into scoping and all of that, I mean, it was brought up a few times, but it would make a lot of sense if we had something programmatic that would define scope, or we had a sample app or that type of thing. Obviously, we want to be independent of a platform, so building a honeypot is not really what we're going for, but you can imagine some sort of config template of some kind. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I made a list of docs that I've seen listed as kind of best practice hardening guides from various providers and various customers and things. We probably need a central official Kubernetes one. Is that something that anyone has the desire and or capacity to try to define?
So I think we have pros, like we have words about hardening in that linked Kubernetes hardening guide and then next paragraph down. But what we're missing is like an example app that has like something in different namespaces that have RBAC guarantees about how those namespaces are separated, something that, some network policy rules and some other stuff that we could say point to kind of like a guarantee that says like, hey, security researchers, start this thing on your laptop. If you can, be running in namespace X and execute code in namespace Y, then that's bad. And file a vulnerability, file a report. Those kind of guarantees is how I would imagine this would be like a nice on-ramp for researchers.
I think the only way you can, or the best way to scope it would be to be able to say this affects like X number of actual production clusters out there. And I mean, because even bad defaults could, there's gray areas, but what matters is if like the majority of our people who are concentrated on this have this issue, and that's the real issue. Which probably to be able to do that, because it's hard, we take a lot of partnerships, I don't know, sounds like work, but I think that would be the ideal way to determine whether it counts or not.
I'm concerned that Kubernetes is so flexible and so pluggable that defining any sort of conformance on the whole, like kind of a generic cluster, might be impossible. There's always, some way that you could plug in something with very little secure or very poor security that would compromise the cluster. And I'm wondering if it would make sense to have some basically scripts or configs or even a certain number of like commercial deployments, and just define it. I recognize that has a lot of problems with kind of it being the relationship between the open source project and kind of these private deployments. But I guess what I'm saying is if we had a model of saying like, run this script, get cluster, if you can compromise that cluster, then it's in scope. Does that make sense?
Would it be crazy to go as far as starting with something like one of the hosted Kubernetes services like GKE or the IBM equivalent or something?
So this is interesting. GKE actually falls under the Google Vulnerability Rewards program. So you can already submit vulnerabilities that pertain to GKE to that. I think this is more of a push of telling a story that Kubernetes is secure everywhere and that you can run Kubernetes securely everywhere. Having the core Kubernetes components be reported centrally and have all the relevant parties involved help triage and fix those bugs.
To give a more concrete example of what I was talking about, defining explicitly which CRI plugins are supported under this scope, and even if bugs in those plugins are out of scope, well, I don't know. Maybe that answers my own question of, if you run a CRI plugin that doesn't implement any isolation of containers and you escape container and compromise the cluster, then we just say that's a bug in that plugin and outside of the Kubernetes scope.
It seems like the sort of program where you could start with a relatively tight scope anyway and then look to expand it over time if it makes more sense to do that, right? I think limiting it down to as much core stuff as you can and maybe pushing almost all plugins as being explicitly out of scope is probably sensible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like actual container escape would fall into out of scope, albeit a really bad bug. It wouldn't be in the scope for our, bounty program. It would be in the scope for something else. Whereas like moving laterally across the Kubernetes namespaces would be in our scope. So something like that, like you have to just define it.
We could also define like multiple scenarios for attacker capabilities and goals. So like another threat model would be I have a container escape, and so I own a node. And what do we think the Kubernetes security model is if you own a node? We think there are things that you can't still do. That's kind of a different scenario from here's a user credential that has access to a namespace, try to run code in another namespace. It might be worth actually having multiple. And then, like someone said, we could start small, but like I think we should try to like pick little profiles like that where you start with this capability, this is your goal. If you can do that, here's money.
There are a couple of documents out trying to define a Kubernetes threat model. I'm not sure if they were ever merged.
They were.
Oh, okay.
We got a bunch of great comments, but we never actually crossed the mile.
Yeah. And having that more well-defined might be a valuable prerequisite for this. So kind of, I'm not sure who was just speaking, but about like, what is the model for a node compromise? What are the expectations? If, container escapes may be out of scope, but once you have escaped, what is within scope?
I did think this is Clayton. Someone probably could take that over for me and help drive it to completion. But I do agree that we want to model specifically. I feel like either we start here and work backwards to the threat model, but we probably shouldn't go much longer without having an actual threat model to reference. We're basically duplicating it every new doc that someone comes up with, unfortunately.
It sounds like it'd be valuable to have two documents that would base this. One is kind of the existing best practices doc securing a cluster, and maybe updating that to what like a super lockdown cluster would look like in some sense. And the second thing would be what you're describing, the threat model, saying if you can do X or Y or Z, that's worth a bug. That's worth a bug bounty. Does that sound right? And then we can talk about how to productionize that to make it repeatable.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And I'd say that makes a lot of sense. I wasn't familiar with the threat model work, but I'll go try and dig that out and see if I can help with that. There was one point you just made about, is this exploitable in a super lockdown version of Kube? I just urge maybe a small degree of caution there, because like take OpenStack, for example. There are ways that you can build that which makes it super, super, super secure. It's just really, really unusable. And so the model that we choose for the bug bounty thing needs to be representative, of, I don't know, maybe a multi-tenant, how you would expect a good multi-tenant service to be deployed with reasonable sort of workable business levels of security assurance around isolation. I'm sure there are probably parallels in Kube where you can kind of go even further to make things more secure, but you almost end up with an academically secure situation where it's probably not terribly functional. I just want to urge caution as part of this scoping work.
Yeah, we could have different configurations and say, like, going back to Maya's point, like, if you can do X when your system is configured like Y, then you get the money, right? So it doesn't have to be a single configuration that is the test. Obviously, we don't want to go crazy and create too many, but if we think there are a few that are representative of what people run in production, like some people run something that's super secure, like where they don't allow any pods to talk to each other, and they have a very restricted pod security policy and all that kind of stuff. And other people have more lax security policies, but are still like following the best practices. We could have both of those out there and then have different, slightly different tests for getting the money in those two different configurations. I don't know. It doesn't have to be just one, is my point.
Are we sort of, I wonder if we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves with the idea of like us even having good best practices to start with. I I think that we've enabled a lot of we've done a lot of building of features that I would love to have audited in terms of like thinking about our authorizers, our emission plugins, and stuff like that. I feel like it gets really hairy when you think about like what a normal deployment of Kubernetes is, thinking about sort of knowing all the holes that can exist in that, and us not really having good recommendations about like what the security boundaries are, even for a soft multi-tenancy cluster. Like we still get a lot of questions about, is the namespace the security boundary, or what objects in a namespace can escalate that we know can escalate. So I wonder how much work we might want to do just to start with defining those security boundaries or security best practices.
Yeah, as Jess alluded to earlier, we started talking about this a bit in SIG Auth, and in the multi-tenancy working group, and we have a couple of documents with kind of ideas around that question, but I definitely agree. We haven't really converged or come close to converging on like, here is a standard configuration that, we define as secure. But I think that's kind of the direction we were hoping to go in. We have not gotten there.
So there's definitely some open work to do here around defining the scope better, and I don't think we're going to define it in the next 10 minutes. What is the path forward to getting this defined, or at least in a good enough place to move forward with the bug bounty program?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of next steps. One is what somebody mentioned earlier, letting the other 6 know what's coming. 2 is securing funding. As I mentioned, I'm trying to do that internally at Google, but can give an update to SIG Auth in a couple of weeks if that's not working out for some reason. And I think there's a question of defining the scope, whether it's just pros, is what Greg mentioned earlier, or we try to do a Minikube setup, or we try to do some other kind of, et cetera. And I'm probably not the right person to do that and would need some help.
Yeah, I guess we'll need to find some owners to actually commit to working on that. I almost wonder if planning some sort of mini summit to get a number of stakeholders in a room and try and hash out that document would be helpful. But maybe something to discuss more offline.
Yeah, there's another question here, which is, I was originally thinking this would be something very cool to announce at KubeCon, which I know is not that far away, and that might be too aggressive. But I think that the pieces to get in place are what we just described. We can also do it, you can imagine doing it in like after the following code freeze, so that I guess it would be July, would be another good kind of timeline to aim for as to when we could announce something like this. There's one last question there I just want to point out as well. Is there any interest in, when I was talking to the Google Vulnerability Rewards Program team, they also mentioned this OSS fuzz project for continuous fuzzing. Is there any interest in joining that? It would be a fairly easy thing to add Kubernetes to that. Apologies if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. I think maybe Greg can chime in, but I think the main concern there was around disclosure timelines.
So it's the standard kind of Google deadline of 90 days. I don't know. It kind of depends on the bug. Like if it's like a big architectural change, that's going to be rough to do in 90 days in Kubernetes. But if it's a small fix, then that's easily enough time. Yeah, there's that. So you kind of sign up for that disclosure timeline. There's also like I'm not sure what the kind of focus of the fuzzer is. I should actually go talk to some Google people about it who run it. But like, is it for a Go project? Is this like, are they seeing value? Oh, actually, so it says it supports C and C++ code. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is not even a good fit. I think we should go talk to the people that run it and figure out.
Makes sense.
So just very briefly on that topic, and it's something I could bring up at a future conversation. There's tools like Sintrabos, which were built to really kind of fuzz and explore APIs of services like Kubernetes. Those guys are always looking for new places to apply that tech, and it may even fit into looking at that workflow. It may fit into how OSS fuzz is working anyway. But yeah, I think if there isn't anyone actively pursuing this sort of thing at the moment, then that might be something I could help with as well.
I'll look into with Greg what the options are for OSS fuzz and what other projects might exist with similar functionality.
All right. Any other topics for discussion in the last 5 minutes? Okay, I think we can wrap up. Thanks, everyone. And see you in 2 weeks.